Number 8. Columbus didn't prove the Earth was round. You've been told the story since elementary school, probably with a dramatic flair. Christopher Columbus, a lone visionary sailing west, defying the flat earthers of his time. He was a brave explorer who set out to prove the world wasn't a giant pancake, a hero of science and geography, a man with the guts to sail off the edge of the world. Except, no. The flat earth idea was already ancient history by the time Columbus set sail. The ancient Greeks had figured out the earth was a sphere centuries before Christ was even born. Eratosthenes, a librarian in ancient Egypt, even calculated the earth's circumference with surprising accuracy just by measuring shadows in two different cities. It was common knowledge among educated people in the 15th century that the world was a globe. The real argument wasn't about shape, but about size. Columbus thought the earth was much smaller than it actually was. He believed Asia was a short, easy sail away. The Spanish and Portuguese scholars, however, had a more accurate number and knew his trip was wildly undersized for the distance. They weren't saying, "You'll fall off the edge." They were saying, "You'll run out of food and water 1,000 miles before you get there." And they were right. He only stumbled upon the Americas because they were conveniently located in the middle of his ill-conceived voyage. So he wasn't a scientific pioneer battling superstition. He was an arrogant dude who got lucky and was bailed out by an entire continent no one knew existed. The whole flat earth myth was mostly invented in the 19th century by American authors trying to make Columbus sound cooler than he was, turning a geographical miscalculation into a heroic struggle against ignorance. Basically, it's the historical equivalent of someone getting lost on a road trip, accidentally finding a new city, and then being praised for their genius navigation skills. Number 7. The Great Wall is not visible from space. Okay, let's get this one straight. You've probably heard this since you were a kid, usually said with a hushed reverence. The Great Wall of China is so massive, so epic, that it's the only man-made structure visible with the naked eye from the moon or even low Earth orbit. It's a statement of human ambition, a testament to what we can build. It's also, to put it bluntly, a total lie. Even astronauts who have been to space, like Chris Hadfield and Gene Cernan, have debunked this. From low Earth orbit, it's just not visible without a zoom lens or binoculars, and even then, it's difficult. It's too narrow, and its color blends in with the surrounding terrain. Think about it. The wall is only about 20 feet wide on average. A major highway is about 120 feet wide. If you can't see a highway from space, you're not going to see a much narrower, camouflaged wall. The myth likely started in the 1930s and was picked up and repeated so often it became one of those facts everyone just knows. The truth is, from the moon, all you can see is the big, beautiful blue and white swirl of Earth. You can't even see continents clearly, let alone a skinny stone fence. So the next time someone brings up the Great Wall as an example of human engineering visible from the heavens, you can confidently tell them they've been bamboozled. It's an impressive achievement, sure, but it's not that impressive. Number 6. Napoleon wasn't short. You've got this mental image of Napoleon Bonaparte, right? The little guy with the huge hat, standing with his hand in his coat, a tiny rage-filled general compensating for his lack of height with a giant ego. It's a classic caricature, a joke told for centuries. Napoleonic complex, we call it. But here's the thing, he wasn't short. This myth is based on a simple misunderstanding and some good old-fashioned British propaganda. When Napoleon died, the French measured him at 5 feet 2 inches, but they were using the old French measuring system, which was different from the British one. When you convert his height to British measurements, he was about 5 feet 7 inches tall. Now, think about the average height for a Frenchman at the time. It was closer to 5 feet 5 inches. That means Napoleon was actually taller than average. He was more like a normal-sized guy in a room full of shorter people. So the real historical figure was the opposite of our modern stereotype. The British, who were his enemies, loved to mock him. They published political cartoons showing him as a tiny, impotent figure. This was a form of psychological warfare, an easy way to belittle a man who was, in reality, a brilliant military strategist who conquered a significant chunk of Europe. The myth was so effective it outlived Napoleon himself. And even today, centuries later, we still think of him as a tiny tyrant. So next time you see a guy who is short and angry, don't call it a Napoleonic complex. It's an insult to both Napoleon and short people everywhere. Number 5. Witches weren't burned at Salem. When you think of the Salem witch trials, you probably picture a bunch of terrified women being tied to stakes and burned alive, right? It's a classic movie scene, a dramatic image of religious fanaticism and hysteria. The reality, however, is much less fiery. In colonial America, the legal punishment for witchcraft was hanging, not burning. The idea of burning witches at the stake was a European thing, specifically a practice more common in places like Germany and England. In Salem, 19 people were hanged and several others died in prison. One man, Giles Corey, refused to enter a plea and was pressed to death with heavy stones, a truly brutal and horrific death, but not burning. So, while the trials were a tragic and unjust miscarriage of justice, the iconic image of witches being burned is historically inaccurate for this particular event. The myth likely persists because burning is a more visceral and dramatic image than hanging, making for a more compelling story in books and movies. The irony is that the actual events, with people being crushed to death and hanged based on flimsy spectral evidence, are horrifying enough on their own. We don't need to add fire to the story to make it a terrifying cautionary tale about the dangers of mass hysteria and baseless accusations. Number 4. Marie Antoinette never said, "Let them eat cake." You know the line. It's the ultimate symbol of aristocratic cluelessness. The starving French peasants are rioting over a lack of bread, and Queen Marie Antoinette, completely out of touch with reality, casually replies, "Qu'ils mangent de la brioche," or "Let them eat cake." This one little quote perfectly encapsulates the disconnect between the royalty and the common people, painting her as a heartless villain of the French Revolution. But here's the twist. She almost certainly never said it. The phrase actually appears in the writings of philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau in his autobiography Confessions, which was written around 1765, long before Marie Antoinette became queen. In the book, he attributes the quote to a great princess, but he doesn't name her. By the time the French Revolution began in 1789, the quote was already a popular urban legend, used to criticize the perceived decadence and indifference of the monarchy as a whole. It was the perfect piece of propaganda, a juicy soundbite that summed up everything the revolutionaries hated about the ruling class. So it was likely an existing myth that was retroactively pinned on Marie Antoinette to make her look like a monster. And it worked. The line became a key part of her historical reputation, even though she wasn't even a teenager when it was first written. This is a classic example of history being shaped by a good story rather than actual fact. She may have been an extravagant and unpopular queen, but she wasn't that out of touch. The idea that she would say such a thing during a time of mass starvation is just too perfect a villain moment to be true. Number 3. No, the Pilgrims weren't wearing buckled hats. Picture the first Thanksgiving. You've got the Pilgrims and the Native Americans sitting down to a feast. The Pilgrims are all dressed up in black suits, big white collars, and those iconic hats with a shiny silver buckle on them. It's a classic image, right up there with turkeys and cornucopias. But here's the fashion truth bomb. Those buckled hats and buckle-adorned shoes? Totally fake. That whole look was an invention of 19th century illustrators who wanted to give the Pilgrims a more distinct and puritanical appearance. The real Pilgrims wore plain, drab clothing in a variety of colors. Brown, green, and beige were common. They didn't have black clothing for everyday wear. And the buckles? They were expensive and difficult to make, so they weren't a common accessory. If anything, they would have used leather ties or simple laces to fasten their shoes and clothing. The hats they wore were more like simple, wide-brimmed felt hats without any buckles. So the next time you see a Thanksgiving decoration with a pilgrim in a buckled hat, you're looking at a historical costume designed for a time period a couple hundred years after the Pilgrims actually lived. It's the equivalent of drawing George Washington in a tuxedo. It looks formal and important, but it's completely wrong for the era. The actual Pilgrims were far less stylish than their myth suggests, and probably a lot more comfortable without all that extra hardware. Number 2. Benjamin Franklin did not discover electricity with a kite. This one is a classic. You've seen the pictures in history books and maybe even in a cartoon. Benjamin Franklin, an old man with a bald head and a key on a string, is out in a thunderstorm flying a kite. He's trying to prove that lightning is a form of electricity, and he's risking his life for science. It's a heroic image of an Enlightenment genius, a moment of pure inspiration that literally captured lightning in a bottle, or, a key. The only problem is the story is probably a myth. Franklin did propose the kite experiment, but he likely never performed it himself. The story we all know and love comes from Franklin's own writings, but the account was published much later by a friend and was probably more of a thought experiment or an exaggerated version of a safer, similar experiment. The real reason to doubt the story is simple. It would have been incredibly, dangerously stupid. If lightning had actually struck the kite, Franklin would have been killed instantly. Even a nearby strike would have sent a lethal electrical charge through the wet kite string. The entire thing reads like a classic urban legend, a just-so story designed to give a dramatic, easy-to-understand narrative to a complex scientific discovery. Franklin was a brilliant scientist who did groundbreaking work with electricity, but his real work was much more methodical and less cinematic than standing out in a lightning storm with a kite. So, while we credit him with the discovery, the method was a lot more about static electricity and carefully insulated wires than about a death-defying act with a piece of string and a key. Number 1. The first Thanksgiving feast was a 3-day barbecue. Let's head back to that Thanksgiving table. We've already established the hats are wrong, but what about the feast itself? You're probably picturing a giant roasted turkey, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, and maybe some pumpkin pie. The classic American Thanksgiving meal. Well, that's a modern invention. The first Thanksgiving, a harvest festival celebrated by the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag people in 1621, was a 3-day-long event, but the menu was a bit different. They probably didn't even have turkey as the centerpiece. While wild turkeys were certainly in the area, the Pilgrims wrote about eating venison, waterfowl, like duck or goose, and other game. There were no potatoes because they hadn't been introduced to the region yet, no cranberry sauce because cranberries were too bitter without a ton of sugar, which was a luxury. And definitely no pumpkin pie. They might have had pumpkins and other gourds, but they lacked the butter and wheat flour needed to make a pie crust. The feast was more like a giant, messy, 3-day outdoor barbecue and potluck. The Native Americans brought 5 deer, which were likely roasted over an open fire. The rest of the meal was probably a mix of whatever the Pilgrims had harvested and whatever the Wampanoag brought, including shellfish, cornmeal, and maybe some other vegetables. The modern Thanksgiving meal, with all its specific fixings, is a tradition that was created much, much later in American history. It's an invented tradition, a holiday menu that was retroactively applied to a historical event to make it feel more familiar and homey.